Welcome to the 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu. You've come to the right place for a deep dive, your shortcut to being well informed by unpacking important sources. Today, we are diving into some really powerful ideas. They come from excerpts from a fantastic book, Thinking in Systems, a primer by Donella Meadows, edited by Diana Wright, and this deep dive is custom tailored for you, the listener, based on the source material you provided.
That's right. Our mission in this deep dive, and drawing from this material, which is part of the 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu, is to really unpack the key concepts. We want to help you understand the different aspects of systems thinking described, and, well, explore how you might start applying these ideas yourself.
So what's the journey look like? We're going to walk through the core ideas presented across the intro material in several key chapters. We'll explore what systems actually are, how they behave sometimes in pre-surprising ways. We'll look at common patterns, those traps and opportunities the book talks about, and maybe most importantly, where you might find the most leverage, the best places to intervene for change.
Yeah, it's going to be an engaging exploration. These concepts can genuinely shift how you see the world, and it's all straight from the text you've shared with us.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Setting the stage.
Yeah.
The overview from the source material.
Right. The book kicks off pointing out something pretty fascinating. Modern systems theory isn't entirely new. It's actually rooted in truths that have been known intuitively for, well, ages. There's like a direct line you can trace from today's systems jargon all the way back to traditional wisdom.
Oh, interesting. So not just techie stuff.
Exactly. The text mentions modern figures, sure, like Jay Forrester and Gregory Bateson, but also classic minds like Albert Einstein. And it even connects to ancient wisdom traditions like from Native Americans and Sufis.
Okay, that really grounds it. So the core idea here really at its heart is that systems thinking asks you to look at the whole picture, the interconnectedness, not just the pieces in isolation.
Precisely. The source uses that brilliant analogy of a slinky toy. You can pull or push on just one coil, but the entire thing reacts, right? The whole shape changes. You can't isolate the effect.
Right, you feel it all the way through.
And what's really intriguing is how system behavior can seem, well, counterintuitive maybe at first glance. But then, once you start seeing the underlying structure, it just clicks into place. It becomes like pure common sense.
Can you give an example from the book?
Sure. The book has some sharp ones, like political leaders don't cause recessions or booms all by themselves. Those ups and downs, they're actually inherent in the fundamental structure of the market system itself.
Okay, so it's built into the system, not just one person's fault.
Exactly. Or think about a company losing market share. It isn't just because of tough competitors. The losing company itself contributes, often significantly, through its own policies, its own choices. It's not just one external cause.
Right, they're part of the system creating that outcome.
Or how oil exporting nations aren't solely responsible for, say, big price surges. The policies of the importing nations, well, they create the vulnerability that makes them susceptible to those price rises in the first place.
That makes sense. Shared responsibility almost.
Sort of. And thinking about health.
Ugh.
The flu virus doesn't just sort of attack you out of the blue. You actually set the conditions in your body, your environment, that allow it to take hold.
We create the opening.
In a way, yes.
Hmm.
And even something really complex and personal like drug addiction. The book frames it not just as an individual failing, but as part of a much larger web of influences, societal issues, all tangled together.
So the traditional way of thinking might try to trace one single cause and effect chain, right? Looking at one piece at a time.
Yeah, the reductionist approach.
But the system lens, it acknowledges that we've actually been dealing with complex systems intuitively our whole lives. Our own bodies, relationships, nature.
Absolutely. We have this innate feel for it. And this intuitive understanding leads us to recognize common system structures, patterns that produce predictable kinds of behavior. The book calls these archetypes.
Archetypes, okay.
They're initially called system traps because, well, they often lead to undesirable outcomes, things getting stuck.
But they're also opportunities.
Yes, that's the crucial flip side. Understanding the underlying structure, the trap itself, is the very first step to transforming it, to creating more desirable behaviors. It shows you where to look.
Okay, let's start building from the ground up then. Chapter 1, the basics. How does the book actually define a system? What are the core components?
They give a pretty clear definition. An interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something.
Okay, interconnected elements, coherently organized, achieve something, purpose.
Exactly. You must have those three things. The elements, the parts, the interconnections, the relationships between the parts, and a function or purpose, what the whole thing does.
Like a school or a city or a factory, or even a living thing like an animal or a forest.
Right, and systems can be nested inside other systems. Cells in an organ, organs in a body.
What's not a system then, by this definition?
The book uses the example of a random pile of sand on the road. You've got elements, the grains of sand, but there aren't really specific interconnections holding them together in an organized way, and there's no overall function it's achieving as a pile.
Right, you add sand, take sand away, it's still just a pile of sand. It doesn't change its fundamental nature or behavior pattern.
Exactly. The key insight here is that a system is truly more than just the sum of its parts. It's the interactions, the structure, the organization that gives it its unique character and its capabilities. It can exhibit dynamic behavior, adaptive behavior, sometimes even goal-seeking behavior that you just never predict by looking at the individual elements alone.
And thinking about those three things, elements, interconnections, purpose, the source, it suggests they have different levels of importance, right? In terms of defining the system's identity.
That's a really interesting point it makes. Generally, changing the elements themselves often have the least effect on the system's core identity.
Really, like changing players on a team.
Yeah, think about a football team. Players come and go every season, but it's still fundamentally the same team playing by the same rules with the same goal. Or your own body. Most of your cells get replaced over, 7 years? But you're still you.
Because the structure and purpose remain.
Right. The system's identity persists because the interconnections, the rules, the relationships, and the purpose stay largely the same.
But if you change the interconnections, that's different.
Change the rules of football to the rules of basketball.
Yeah.
With the same players, and you've got a dramatically different system, right?
Sure.
Or fundamentally alter how a university grades students or grants tenure. You can radically change the system's behavior and identity.
And purpose is obviously crucial too. It defines what the system is trying to achieve.
Absolutely. Whether that purpose is explicit and intended or sort of emergent and implicit, and systems can have multiple purposes, sometimes even conflicting ones operating at different levels.
Like in a university.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
The university's overall purpose might be, discovering and preserving knowledge. But individual students have a purpose, getting grades, getting a degree. Professors might have a purpose, getting tenure, publishing research. Administrators want smooth operations.
And these can clash sometimes.
They can. Harmonizing these various sub-purposes is a huge challenge, but it's vital for the overall system to function effectively towards its main overarching goal.
Okay, so to really dig into how systems behave, the book introduces a really foundational concept. It uses that classic bathtub analogy, stocks and flows. Let's break that down. What exactly is a stock in this context?
A stock is basically an accumulation of something. It's the stuff you can see, measure, or count at any given point in time.
Like the amount of water in the bathtub.
Exactly. Or the money in your bank account, the population of a city, the amount of lumber inventory sitting in a yard, the level of trust in a relationship. It's a quantity.
Okay, and the flows.
Flows are the rates of change into or out of that stock over time.
So the water coming in from the faucet is an inflow.
Right, measured in, say, gallons per minute. And the water going out the drain is an outflow, also a rate.
Or interest being added to your bank account is an inflow.
And spending money is an outflow. Logging trees is an outflow from the forest stock. Births are an inflow to the population stock. Deaths are an outflow.
Got it. Stocks are the level, flows are the rates changing that level. So what's the big takeaway here? Why is this distinction so important?
The core principle is incredibly simple, but also incredibly profound. Stocks change slowly because flows take time.
Takes time to fill the tub, takes time to drain it.
Precisely. Flows happen over time, and they have to accumulate or deplete the stock. This means stocks act like delays or lags or buffers in the system. They give systems inertia, momentum.
So systems don't just change instantaneously.
Almost never. Changes in stocks set the pace of the system's dynamics. If you want to understand why a system is behaving the way it is or how to change its behavior, you often have to look at its stocks and the flows influencing them.
That makes a lot of sense. And the source also points out that having these stocks, these buffers, allows the inflows and outflows to be independent, at least temporarily. They don't have to be perfectly balanced all the time.
Right, like having gasoline storage tanks. You can keep driving cars, outflow, even if the refinery's inflow slow down for a bit, or a store having inventory stock. It allows continuity despite variations in supply, inflow, and demand, outflow.
Which brings us to the structures that actually control those flows. Feedback loops.
Yes. This is where it gets really dynamic. Feedback loops are structures where information about the level of a stock flows back somehow to influence the inflows or outflows that are changing that very stock.
It's like the system is monitoring itself and adjusting.
Exactly. And the book highlights two fundamental types of feedback loops. First up, balancing feedback loops, often labeled B loops.
Balancing. Okay, so they try to keep things stable.
Yeah, they are goal-seeking, stabilizing. They try to bring a stock towards some desired state, some target or equilibrium. They work to reduce a discrepancy between the current state and the goal.
Like the coffee example in the book.
Perfect.
Yeah.
The coffee energy example. You feel tired. Your actual energy stock is below your desired energy level. That's the discrepancy. So you drink coffee, an action driven by the discrepancy to increase the inflow to your energy stock.
Makes sense. Or the coffee cooling down.
Right, the coffee cooling example. The temperature of your hot coffee stock is higher than the room temperature, goal or reference point. This discrepancy drives the rate of heat loss, outflow, from the coffee. As the coffee cools, the discrepancy gets smaller, and the rate of cooling slows down.
So these loops always work to close a gap, to reach a target, and they kind of naturally slow down as they get closer.
Precisely. They maintain stability or drive towards equilibrium.
Got it. And the other type?
Reinforcing feedback loops, or R loops. These are completely different beasts. They're self-enhancing, amplifying. They drive exponential growth, or sometimes exponential collapse.
Whoa. Runaway loops?
Yeah, exactly. The book's examples are really vivid. Think of two siblings starting to push each other. One push leads to a pushback, which leads to a harder push. It escalates. That's a reinforcing loop.
Or the wage price spiral.
Classic example. Wages go up, so companies raise prices to cover costs. Higher prices mean workers demand higher wages, which pushes prices up further. Round and round it goes, amplifying itself.
And population growth.
More rabbits lead to more baby rabbits, which grow up to be more rabbits, leading to even more baby rabbits. Assuming nothing limits them, it's exponential growth driven by a reinforcing loop.
Okay, those are clearly powerful forces, one stabilizing, one amplifying. So what happens when you put them together in a real system?
That's where the real complexity comes in. Real-world systems are almost always intricate webs, linking many feedback loops, both balancing and reinforcing, all operating at different speeds, tugging against each other.
So it's not just simple stability or simple runaway growth.
Rarely. It's this constant interplay, this dynamic tension between different loops that produces the rich, complex, often surprising behaviors we see in the economy, in ecosystems, in our own lives. Things shifting, oscillating, finding temporary balance, then maybe tipping into growth or decline.
Okay, so with stocks, flows, and these two types of feedback loops as our basic building blocks, let's take that brief visit to the system zoo the book talks about in Chapter 2. Looking at how these parts combine to create common, identifiable patterns of behavior, those archetypes again.
Right. Let's look at some common combinations. One classic structure is simply a stock being controlled by competing balancing loops.
Okay, like what?
Think about the thermostat example again. Controlling the temperature in a heated room. Your goal is the desired temperature setting. That's the target for the stock, which is the actual room temperature.
Right.
The thermostat constantly compares the actual temperature stock to the desired temperature goal.
Right.
The difference, the discrepancy, drives the furnace, the inflow of heat.
Okay, that's one balancing loop trying to raise the temperature to the goal.
Exactly. But at the same time, there's heat loss to the outside and outflow. This outflow is driven by the difference between the room temperature and the outside temperature. That's essentially another balancing loop trying to pull the room temperature down towards the outside temperature.
So two balancing loops working against each other, trying to pull the stock room temperature towards different points, but the thermostat furnace loop is designed to win, keeping it near the set point.
Precisely. They compete, and the system balances around the thermostat's goal. The car dealership inventory example works the same way. The goal is the desired inventory level, a stock. The dealer compares actual inventory to the desired level. The discrepancy drives ordering new cars from the factory, inflow, one balancing loop trying to increase the stock.
And sales.
Sales are the outflow, driven by customer demand. That's effectively another balancing loop trying to decrease the stock. Again, two competing loops trying to keep the inventory stock around the dealer's target level.
Okay, that seems straightforward enough, but then the book introduces a complication that changes everything. Delays.
Yes. This is where it gets really interesting and, honestly, where a lot of system surprises come from. What happens in that seemingly simple car dealership example? if you add realistic delays.
Like delays in noticing that sales have changed.
Exactly. Maybe the dealer averages sales figures over a few weeks or a month to smooth out noise. That's a perception delay.
Okay.
Then there's a delay in actually placing the order, maybe paperwork, batching orders, and then a significant delay before the factory produces and delivers the cars.
So multiple delays in that balancing loop trying to adjust inventory. What happens?
The source highlights the classic outcome. Oscillations.
Things start swinging back and forth.
Wildly. Imagine a sudden, permanent increase in customer sales. Because of the delays, the dealer doesn't see it right away. Then orders take time, cars take time to arrive. By the time the extra cars finally show up, inventory might have dropped really low. Maybe they over-ordered in panic.
So the inventory shoots way above the target.
Right. Then, seeing the high inventory, they cut orders drastically. But sales are still high, and deliveries slow down. So inventory plummets below the target. Overshoot, undershoot, back and forth.
Wow. Just from adding delays to a simple balancing loop.
It's a fundamental principle, the book states clearly. A delay in a balancing feedback loop makes a system likely to oscillate. The longer the delay relative to how fast things are changing, the worse the oscillations tend to be.
And the book mentions the dealer trying to fix it by, say, reacting faster to sales figures. But that can make it worse.
Sometimes, yes. If you shorten the perception delay, but the delivery delay is still long, you might react too strongly to short-term sales blips, placing big orders or canceling them abruptly, which just amplifies the swings when the delayed consequences finally hit. It's tricky.
So things like business cycles, could they be seen as these kinds of oscillations rippling through interconnected industries, all with their own production and ordering delays?
That's a major application of this archetype, absolutely. Interconnected stocks and flows with delays leading to cyclical behavior.
Okay, what about combining the two types of loops, reinforcing and balancing?
A fundamental archetype there is population dynamics. The stock, obviously, is the size of the population.
And the reinforcing loop is births.
Right. More people lead to more potential parents, which leads to more births, which adds to the population stock, R-loop driving growth.
And the balancing loop?
Deaths. Deaths subtract from the population stock, acting as a balancing or draining force, the B-loop.
So population grows exponentially when the reinforcing birth loop is stronger than the balancing death loop.
Exactly. When the birth rate significantly exceeds the death rate. But this is where we see a crucial concept, shifting dominance.
Meaning which loop is in control can change.
Precisely. The behavior of the system changes over time as the relative strengths of the loops shift. For example, if fertility rates start to fall, maybe due to economic development, education, access to contraception, the reinforcing birth loop weakens.
Yes.
If fertility falls enough so that the birth rate eventually equals the death rate, the neither loop dominates in driving net change. The R loop isn't strong enough to cause runaway growth. The B loop isn't strong enough relative to births to cause decline.
So the population stabilizes.
It reaches a dynamic equilibrium. The stock level might stay constant or fluctuate around a level because the inflows and outflows are balanced. This shift in which loop has more influence fundamentally changes the system's overall behavior pattern over time, from growth to stability or potentially to decline if the death loop becomes dominant.
That's a powerful idea. Loop dominance isn't fixed.
Not at all. It's often the key to understanding long-term system evolution. The source also uses this stock flow loop thinking to explore archetypes related to resource use. First, the structure of exploiting a non-renewable resource, like oil drilling. Okay, what are the key parts there? You have a stock of economic capital, things like drilling rigs, refineries, pipelines. This capital stock grows via a reinforcing loop. Selling oil generates profit. Some of that profit gets reinvested into buying more capital, more rigs, etc. More capital allows you to extract and sell more oil, generating more profit, leading to more investment. That's the R loop driving growth of the capital base.
Makes sense, but it's constrained.
Yes, crucially, by the stock of the non-renewable resource itself, the finite amount of oil in the ground.
So where's the balancing loop that limits the growth?
It comes from the interaction between the capital and the resource. More capital leads to a higher rate of oil extraction and outflow from the resource stock. This obviously lowers the amount of resource remaining. As the resource stock gets depleted, it becomes harder and more expensive to extract each barrel of oil. The yield per unit of capital goes down. This means lower profit per unit of capital. Lower profit means less money available for reinvestment. Less reinvestment slows down the growth of the capital stock, eventually stopping or even reversing it.
Ah, so the very success of the reinforcing growth loop, building capital, extracting resource, activates a balancing loop, resource depletion reducing profitability that eventually strangles the growth.
You got it. The dynamic pattern is almost inevitable. Exponential growth in capital and extraction rates, followed by a peak as the resource constraints bite harder and harder, and then a decline as depletion overtakes new investment.
Does it matter how much resource you start with or how fast you grow?
The source notes that a higher initial resource stock or a faster initial growth rate, a stronger R loop, often just leads to a faster rise, a higher peak, and then a steeper, faster collapse on the other side, unless the system fundamentally transforms itself somehow before hitting the wall.
Ouch. Okay, what about exploiting a renewable resource, like a fishery? How is that structure different?
Well, you still have the economic capital stock, the
Huh.
fishing boats and gear, growing via that same reinforcing profit reinvestment loop. More boats catch more fish, generating profit for more boats.
Okay, same R loop for capital.
But the resource stock, the fish population, is different. It's renewable. It has its own natural regeneration inflow. Fish reproduce.
Right. So there's a potential balancing act.
Yes, you still have the balancing loop from harvesting.
Hmm.
More fishing capital boats leads to a higher harvest rate, which acts as an outflow, reducing the fish population stock.
But the fish fight back, biologically speaking?
Exactly. The fish population itself has an internal reinforcing loop driving its own growth up to the carrying capacity of its environment.
Right.
More fish in the population lead to a higher rate of reproduction, regeneration inflow, which leads to even more fish.
So you have the capital R loop driving harvest up, the harvest B loop driving fish down, and the fish's own R loop trying to drive fish back up. This sounds unstable.
It very often is. The typical dynamic described is that the fishing capital and the harvest often grow exponentially at first, driven by that reinvestment loop.
Following the money.
Right. But if the harvest rate grows to exceed the fish population's maximum sustainable regeneration rate, the fish stock starts to decline. And because the harvest pressure is still high, lots of boats, the stock can collapse quite rapidly.
And the fishing industry collapses too.
Often, yes, the harvest collapses shortly after the resource does. Sometimes, the book notes, the capital, the boats, might survive if the pressure is eased and the resource has a chance to recover, but the boom and bust cycle is very common in renewable resource exploitation.
These examples really show the power of mapping out the stocks, flows, and loops.
Absolutely. The source briefly mentions that system dynamics models, which explicitly map these structures, are incredibly useful here. They let you explore possible futures under different conditions. What if we set harvest quotas? What if fuel prices change investment? Asking those crucial what-if questions to understand potential long-term consequences.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. We've seen how systems behave and some common problematic patterns. But Chapter 3 looks at why systems work so well much of the time. What gives them their robustness, their cleverness almost.
The source highlights three really critical properties that contribute to their success and also their complexity. The first one is resilience.
Resilience, like bouncing
Yeah,
back.
exactly. It's the system's ability to withstand disturbances, to absorb perturbations, and to recover its basic structure and function afterwards. It's fundamentally a measure of its ability to survive.
Where does this resilience come from? Is it just being strong?
Not just brute strength, it arises more subtly from having many different feedback loops operating in various ways, often at different timescales, and frequently with redundancy built in. If one pathway fails, others can compensate.
Ah, multiple ways to achieve the same goal.
Right. The book even introduces concepts like meta-resilience, which are feedback loops designed to restore or rebuild other feedback loops if they get damaged.
Wow, loops, fixing loops.
And even meta-resilience, which connects to the next property, self-organization. This is the capacity for loops to actually learn, create, and evolve entirely new restorative structures when faced with novel challenges.
So resilience isn't about staying exactly the same rigidly. It's about adaptability and the capacity to maintain function.
Precisely. And the key takeaway here is profound. Systems need to be managed for resilience, not just for maximum output or efficiency or short-term stability.
Why not just max out efficiency?
Because a system optimized purely for efficiency might be incredibly productive under stable conditions, but it becomes brittle. It has no slack, no buffer, no alternative pathways. The first unexpected shock, a supply chain disruption, a sudden change in demand, an environmental event, can cause it to collapse entirely.
Whereas a resilient system might be a bit less efficient in the good times.
But it's one that survives the bad times. It can bend without breaking.
Okay, resilience is key. What's the second property?
Self-organization. This is the truly amazing capacity of many systems to make their own structure more complex, seemingly spontaneously. To learn, to create novelty, to diversify, to evolve.
You see this in nature all the time, right?
Everywhere. Snowflakes forming intricate, unique patterns from simple water molecules. Seeds sprouting and differentiating into complex plants. Babies learning to walk and talk, exploring their world. Communities spontaneously organizing to solve local problems after a disaster.
It feels like systems have this built-in drive towards complexity and learning.
It seems to be a fundamental property of living systems, yes. We often take it for granted, but it's there. And importantly, the source notes, it can be suppressed by overly rigid external control or micromanagement.
Trying to force a system into a fixed mold can kill its creativity.
Exactly. And fascinatingly, the book points out that simple organizing principles or rules can lead to incredibly complex and sophisticated structures. Think of fractal patterns like the Koch snowflake or fern complex shapes generated by repeating very simple rules.
Or how a single fertilized egg develops into a human being.
A prime example. An incredibly complex structure arising from a relatively simple set of genetic rules guiding cell differentiation and organization. Self-organization is so fundamental, the book argues, that even really oppressive or dysfunctional structures often can't fully kill it. Life finds a way to adapt, reorganize, and create novelty underneath the surface.
Amazing. Okay, resilience, self-organization.
Yeah.
What's the third property?
Hierarchy. This is the very common pattern of systems being organized in nested subsystems. Subsystems within subsystems within subsystems.
Like Russian dolls. Cells make up organs, organs make up a body.
Bodies form families, families are part of communities, communities form cities, nations, the global system, the biosphere. It's organization in layers.
And the source uses that great story of the two watchmakers, Tempest and Hora, to illustrate why this hierarchical structure is so effective.
Yeah, it's a perfect parable. Tempest tried to assemble his watches piece by tiny piece directly. Any interruption to the phone ringing meant the whole delicate assembly fell apart, and he had to start over from scratch. Hora, on the other hand, was smarter. He first built stable subassemblies, maybe groups of 10 gears that held together firmly. Then he assembled the final watch from these larger, stable subassemblies.
So if Hora was interrupted while working on one subassembly,
He only lost the work on that one small subassembly. The completed ones were safe. He could finish watches much faster and more reliably than Tempest.
so hierarchy creates stable building blocks.
Exactly. It works because the relationships and interactions within a given subsystem, like the gears in Hora's subassembly or the cells within an organ, are generally denser and stronger than the interactions between different subsystems, connecting the subassemblies or linking different organs.
This creates boundaries of sorts.
It does. This differential linking minimizes feedback delays within the subsystem, allowing it to become efficient and stable relatively independently. And the overall structure, being built from these stable modules, provides resilience for the whole system. If one part fails, it doesn't necessarily bring down the entire thing.
It also means hierarchies are, as the book says, partially decomposable. You can study one subsystem somewhat in isolation.
Right. Reductionist science studying the heart or a single market is possible and incredibly useful because of this hierarchical structure. But the book adds a crucial caution. You must always remember the connections.
Don't forget the rest of the system.
Exactly. You have to remember the links to other subsystems at the same level, and also to the levels above and below in the hierarchy. A disease, for instance, might manifest in an organ, but its origins could lie in a faulty gene, lower level, or a malfunctioning immune system, same level, different subsystem, or exposure to toxins in the workplace, higher level system. Understanding requires looking across levels.
Okay, so systems have these amazing properties: resilience, self-organization, hierarchy. Yet, as we said earlier, they constantly surprise us. Chapter 4 digs into why systems surprise us. It's like a warning list about how our usual ways of thinking fall short.
It really is. And it's crucial because if we understand why we tend to be surprised, maybe we can anticipate better or at least react more wisely when surprises happen. So what's the first big reason our mental models often fail us?
The book talks about confusing events, behavior over time, and system structure.
Exactly. We humans are often fixated on events. The daily news headline, the quarterly profit report, the stock market crash yesterday, the election result.
That's what gets reported, what grabs attention.
Right. But events are just the surface ripples. They're the outputs, the symptoms of the system operating. Reacting only to events trying to explain just one data point is like playing whack-a-mole. You're not addressing the underlying pattern or cause.
So, looking beyond single events.
Better is seeing behavior over time, looking for the trends, the patterns, the oscillations, the growth curves. How has this variable changed over months, years,
It's
decades?
like tracking unemployment rates over time or market share trends.
Yes. Econometric models often do this, looking for statistical correlations between different flows over time. But the source argues this is still limited. Why? Because flows, like spending or hiring, aren't directly and stably caused by other flows. They're ultimately driven by the stocks in the system and the feedback structure that connects them.
Say more about that.
Remember the thermostat example. You could build a statistical model showing a correlation between the past flow of heat from the furnace and the past outdoor temperature. It might fit the historical data well,
Okay.
but that statistical model wouldn't capture the underlying structure. The goal-seeking feedback loop involving the thermostat comparing the actual room temperature, a stock, to the desired temperature, a goal, and controlling the furnace flow accordingly. The statistical correlation might break down completely if the structure changes, like if someone opens a window.
So correlation doesn't reveal the causal structure.
Not reliably. The most powerful level of understanding, the one that gives you the best chance to anticipate and influence the future, is understanding the system structure itself.
The elements, the interconnections, the purpose, and especially those feedback loops.
Yes, because the structure is what generates the behavior, which in turn produces the events. If you understand the structure, you understand why the system behaves as it does, and you can start thinking intelligently about how to change that structure to get different behavior.
Okay, that's a huge one. Focus on structure, not just events or surface patterns. What's another reason systems surprise us?
Our inherently linear minds in a nonlinear world. We just naturally tend to assume simple cause and effect proportional relationships.
Yeah.
Double the input, double the output. Add one more car, traffic slows down just a tiny bit.
But the real world rarely works that way.
Almost never. Systems are rife with nonlinearities. Add one too many cars to that highway, and suddenly traffic flow doesn't just slow down a bit, it collapses into a gridlock jam. A threshold is crossed.
Right.
Soil erosion might be slow at first, then accelerate dramatically once vegetation cover is lost. The effectiveness of advertising might hit diminishing returns, or even become counterproductive if overdone.
And these non-linearities mess with our predictions.
Big time. Because nonlinearities mean that the strength or dominance of feedback loops can shift dramatically and suddenly as stocks or other variables change. A system that was exhibiting steady growth might abruptly tip into decline, or vice versa, because a nonlinearity kicked in and changed which loop was running the show.
Like the spruce budworm example the book uses, that seemed pretty nonlinear.
Absolutely. Applying insecticide seems like a linear solution. More spray, fewer budworms. Simple, right?
Seems logical.
But the spray nonlinearly affects the whole ecosystem. It turns out it kills the budworm's natural predators and parasites even more effectively than it kills the budworms themselves.
Oh, so it weakens the natural balancing loop that was keeping the budworms in check.
Exactly. The unintended consequence is that the forest ecosystem becomes dependent on continuous spraying. And because the natural controls are gone, it's actually more vulnerable to even bigger, more devastating outbreaks in the future if the spraying stops or becomes less effective. A linear intervention created a nonlinear, worse outcome. Yikes. Okay, what else trips us up?
The problem of non-existent boundaries. We draw lines on maps, create departments and organizations, separate the economy from the environment in our models. We create boundaries for convenience, to make problems seem manageable.
But the real world doesn't respect those boundaries.
Not at all. The world is a continuum. What we call side effects or externalities are usually just effects of our actions that fall outside the arbitrary boundary we drew around our analysis. We didn't foresee them, or we chose to ignore them.
Like assuming pollution just goes away.
Classic example. Garbage has to go somewhere.
Yeah.
CO2 emissions affect the global climate. The book emphasizes that physical things, resources, pollutants, they come from somewhere, they go somewhere, they keep moving in cycles. The hydrological cycle, geological cycles, nutrient cycles.
So drawing boundaries is tricky. It's essential for analysis, but you have to be aware of the limitations. If your boundary is too narrow, you miss crucial feedbacks and connections, leading to surprise downstream effects. If your boundary is too wide, the complexity becomes overwhelming, and you can't find clear answers.
Finding the right scale.
And realizing that as you expand your time horizon, thinking longer term, more and more connections become relevant. Everything eventually connects.
Delays also cause surprises, right? Time lags.
Oh, massively.
Yeah.
Systems simply take time to respond. There are always delays between an action and its full consequence. Plants take time to grow. Mail takes time to be delivered. Consumers take time to react to price changes or new products. Building a power plant or a highway takes years, decades even.
And these delays make management hard.
Incredibly hard. They mess with feedback. You make a decision now, but you won't see the real results for months or years. By the time the feedback arrives, the situation might have changed entirely.
Like trying to steer a battleship with a long delay between turning the wheel and the ship actually changing course.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
The book mentions Jay Forrester's famous rule of thumb. Estimate the most obvious delay in your system, and then multiply it by at least 3 to get a better sense of how long it might really take for the full impacts of a change to ripple through. We consistently underestimate delays.
Multiply by 3. Wow.
Yeah. And long delays, relative to how quickly things are changing or how quickly you need to respond, make systems incredibly difficult to manage stably. Trying to build power plants to meet fluctuating future demand is a classic example. Or the historical failures of centrally planned economies trying to coordinate production and distribution across vast systems with huge information and transportation lags.
Okay, and the last big source of surprise the chapter mentions is bounded rationality.
Right. We often like to model people as perfectly rational calculators, always optimizing everything based on complete information. But that's just not how humans work.
We're not computers.
We're not. The reality, as Herbert Simon pointed out and the book emphasizes, is that people make decisions based on the limited local information available to them right here, right now. We don't know everything about the whole system, especially distant parts. We are satisficers, not optimizers. We look for a good enough solution that works for our immediate situation, rather than searching indefinitely for the absolute best possible outcome for the entire system.
So fishermen don't know the exact total fish stock or what every other boat is planning to catch.
Exactly. Businesses don't know exactly what their competitors are investing, or precisely how big the market will be next year, or what new technologies might emerge. We operate with incomplete information.
And this bounded rationality means our decisions might not be optimal for the whole system.
Often, yes, because we naturally focus on furthering our own nearby interests or solving our immediate problems based on the information we do have. We often ignore or are simply unaware of the potential impacts of our actions on distant parts of the system or on the long-term health of the whole.
But the book makes a crucial point here, doesn't it? It's not just about flawed individuals.
No, this is key. The system structure itself, the way information flows or doesn't flow, the incentives people face, the rules and constraints they operate under, is what shapes how boundedly rational actors behave.
So blaming the people might be missing the point.
Often, yes. The source stresses, changing the people in a system often won't change the overall behavior if the underlying structure, the information, incentives, rules stays the same. People will adapt to the system they're put in. Think about the famous Stanford prison experiment, or the book's example of how simply moving electric meters from basements to visible hallways in Dutch houses changed energy consumption. The structure changed the feedback, influencing behavior.
This is the real leverage isn't trying to make everyone perfectly rational and all-knowing.
Which is impossible anyway. The leverage lies in redesigning the system structure itself, improving the quality, timeliness, and relevance of the information people get, aligning incentives so that doing what's good locally also benefits the whole, changing constraints and rules to guide behavior in better directions. That insight, understanding structure's influence on bounded rationality, is a really valuable takeaway from the 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu material we're looking at.
Okay, that's a fantastic overview of why systems can be so tricky and surprising. Now, let's dive into Chapter 5, which focuses on those recurring problematic patterns the system traps, which, crucially, the book reframes as also being potential opportunities if we can just understand their structure.
Exactly. These are common, recognizable system structures, the archetypes that reliably produce persistent, undesirable behaviors. But understanding why they produce those behaviors is the first step towards figuring out how to intervene and turn the trap into something better. The first one the book tackles is policy resistance, sometimes called fixes that fail.
Policy resistance. The symptom here is that the system just seems stuck, right? You try interventions, you push policies, but nothing really changes or things even get worse.
Precisely. And the underlying cause is often that the different actors or subsystems within the larger system have conflicting goals and are pulling in different directions. Each part is rationally pursuing its own objectives, but their actions cancel each other out or create compensating feedback that defeats the policy intervention.
Like the drug supply example the book uses.
Perfect illustration. You have addicts seeking drugs, Law enforcement trying to eradicate supply, dealers trying to maintain profits and avoid arrest, politicians trying to look tough, citizens wanting safety. Everyone is pulling hard, but often in opposing ways. So a crackdown in one area might just shift dealing to another area, or push addicts to different drugs, or increase prices, making crime more lucrative. The overall problem resists the fix.
So the system fights back against the policy.
In effect, yes. Interventions by one group are met with adaptive countermoves by others seeking their own goals. The way out, the book suggests, isn't usually just pushing harder on one lever. It often involves finding ways to get the different actors to transcend their conflicting goals, perhaps by finding or articulating a larger shared goal that everyone can buy into.
Like the example of Sweden's historical population policy.
Right. Instead of just battling over population numbers, growth versus limits, they managed to reframe the goal around ensuring a high quality of life and opportunity for all children, which changed the dynamics of the debate and led to more collaborative solutions. Aligning or transcending goals is key.
Okay, next trap. The very famous tragedy of the commons.
Ah, yes, a classic. The symptom is the predictable overuse, degradation, and potential collapse of a shared, limited resource that is open to many users. Think fisheries, grazing land, clean air, clean water, even bandwidth in some cases.
And the cause. What's the underlying structure?
It's a structural flaw in the feedback. Each individual user gets the full, direct, immediate benefit from using one more unit of the resource. Catching one more fish, grazing one more cow, emitting one more puff of pollution. The benefit is private and tangible.
Okay, it makes sense to use it.
But the cost of that use, the slight depletion of the fish stock, the slight degradation of the pasture, the slight increase in air pollution is shared among all users of the commons. The cost is diluted, spread out, and often delayed.
So the feedback signal to the individual user saying, hey, you're hurting the resource, is weak, delayed, or non-existent.
Exactly. The short-term individual incentive is always to take a little bit more, because the personal gain outweighs the tiny shared slice of the eventual collective pain. But when everyone acts on that same rational incentive, the collective result is ruin for all the tragedy.
Overfishing, collapsing fisheries, pastures turning to desert, climate change.
All examples. The way out, the book argues, isn't usually just appealing to people's conscience. Education and exhortation alone rarely work against strong structural incentives. You must strengthen or add the missing feedback loops.
How?
Two main ways. One is privatization divide the commons, so individuals own their piece and thus directly experience the consequences of mismanaging it. But that's often impossible or undesirable for things like the atmosphere or oceans.
So the other way.
Regulation. Implementing rules that limit access or use, agreed upon by the users themselves, what Garrett Hardin called mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. Things like fishing quotas, pollution permits or taxes, grazing limits, even traffic lights and parking meters managing shared road space. You need rules and enforcement to protect the commons from rational individual overuse.
Okay, tragedy of the commons. What's next? Drift to low performance.
This one is insidious. The symptom is a gradual creeping decline in the system's performance over time. Things just keep getting worse, standards slip, expectations lower.
And the cause? It's not necessarily external pressure.
Often not. The core mechanism is allowing the standard or the goal for performance to be influenced by past performance, especially if past performance was poor.
How does that work?
Imagine a situation where performance dips. If people react by saying, well, things are bad now, maybe our goal was too high, let's lower the target to be more realistic, you create a reinforcing loop.
A downward spiral.
Exactly. Poor performance leads to lower goals. Lower goals make the current poor performance seem acceptable, or even like an improvement. This validates the lower goals, making it easier to lower them again next time performance dips. The system's expectations erode, and performance drifts steadily downward. Things are bad, but hey, they were even worse last year, so this isn't so bad.
That sounds depressingly familiar in some contexts. How do you escape that drift?
The key is to anchor the performance standards. Don't let the goal be eroded by past failures. Keep the standards absolute. This is the quality we aim for, period. Or, even better, base the goals on the best past performance achieved, or on an external benchmark.
So you create the opposite loop.
Right. Aiming high based on best achievements can create a reinforcing loop of drift to high performance, where success reinforces higher aspirations.
Okay, drift to low performance. Next archetype, escalation.
This one is dynamic and often dangerous. The symptom is when two or more actors, competing in some way, get locked into a pattern where their stock levels, like weapons, advertising budgets, prices in a price war, ratchet up and up, often exponentially.
Each trying to outdo the other.
Precisely. The underlying structure is a reinforcing loop where the state of actor A's stock is determined by trying to stay ahead of or exceed actor B's stock, and the state of actor B's stock is determined by trying to stay ahead of actor A's stock.
A vicious cycle.
A classic reinforcing feedback structure. My action provokes your reaction, which provokes a stronger action from me, which provokes an even stronger reaction from you.
Arms races between nations are the classic example, right?
Absolutely. But also price wars between competing companies where each cut prompts a deeper cut from the rival. Or escalating advertising budgets where each company tries to shout louder than the competitor.
How do these end?
Often badly. They can end in mutual exhaustion or collapse when the costs become unsustainable for one or both parties.
Oh.
The way out. The book suggests the best strategy is often to avoid getting into the escalation dynamic in the first place.
Don't take the bait.
Right. Refuse to compete on those terms or actively seek to negotiate de-escalation, perhaps by introducing balancing loops that cap or control the runaway growth.
Okay, escalation. Next trap. Success to the successful.
This feels very relevant in many parts of society. The symptom is that winners tend to keep winning and losers tend to keep losing. Resources and opportunities flow disproportionately to those who are already succeeding.
Like the rich get richer, the poor get poorer.
And that's a prime example. The underlying cause is reinforcing loop structure, where the winners of some initial competition are systematically rewarded with more of the resources or means needed to win even more in the future.
How does that work?
Think about it. The company with higher profits can invest more in R&D, marketing, and attracting talent, making it more likely to increase its market share and profits further. The student who gets into a better school gets better connections and opportunities, increasing their chances of future success. Someone with existing wealth can access better investment opportunities or borrow money more easily than someone without collateral.
So success breeds success, and lack of success can trap you.
Exactly. The reinforcing loop systematically advantages the winners and disadvantages the losers, leading to increasing inequality and potentially monopolies or entrenched elites.
How can you counter this powerful dynamic?
It's tough, as the reinforcing loop is strong. The book suggests interventions that periodically level the playing field. Think about rules in games that give advantages to trailing players or handicaps in sports. In society, this could involve things like progressive taxation, antitrust regulations to prevent monopolies, investments in public education to provide opportunity regardless of background, or other forms of redistribution.
Or designing the system for fairness from the start.
Ideally, yes. Building in mechanisms that prevent the reinforcing loop from completely taking over and ensuring that opportunities aren't solely allocated based on past success.
Okay, success to the successful. Now let's get to the one you mentioned, is highlighted in the 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu material, shifting the burden to the intervener, often leading to addiction.
Yes, this is a really critical and pervasive trap. The symptom is twofold. First, the original problem persists or keeps recurring despite ongoing efforts to fix it. Second, the system itself becomes progressively weaker and more dependent on the external intervention.
Like becoming addicted to the fix.
Exactly. The underlying cause is a solution or policy that addresses only the symptoms of a deeper problem, providing temporary relief, but crucially, doing nothing to fix the underlying structural cause.
Okay, symptom relief isn't a real solution.
Not only that, but the intervention often actively weakens the system's own inherent ability to solve the problem or maintain itself. The external help undermines the system's own resilience and competence.
How does that happen?
Imagine using pesticides constantly, the intervention, to control pests. It relieves the symptom, fewer pests short term. But it might also kill beneficial insects and disrupt the soil ecosystem, weakening the system's natural pest control capacity. The farm becomes dependent on the pesticides. Or providing subsidies to an inefficient industry, it relieves the financial pain, symptom, but reduces the pressure to innovate and become competitive, weakening the system's ability to survive on its own.
So you create a destructive reinforcing loop of dependency. The intervention relieves the symptom, which reduces the perceived need for the system to fix itself, which lets the underlying problem fester, which makes the symptom return, requiring more intervention.
Precisely. It's the structure of addiction, whether chemical or institutional. The book lists many examples. Drug addiction itself, of course, but also welfare programs that may create disincentives to work, foreign aid that props up corrupt governments, relying on calculators, eroding mental math skills, building more highways, relieving congestion temporarily but discouraging investment in public transit, fixing oil prices, reducing the incentive for fuel efficiency.
It's everywhere once you look for it. So how do you escape this addiction trap? It sounds really difficult.
It is, because the short-term relief feels good or necessary. The source strongly cautions against relying primarily on symptom-relieving policies. The focus must be on long-term restructuring to address the root causes of the problem.
Strengthen the system itself.
Yes, and if an intervention is necessary as a temporary measure, it should be designed explicitly to help restore the system's own capacity to manage the problem. The intervener's goal should be to work themselves out of a job.
And the timing is critical.
Absolutely. The dependent system needs to actively rebuild its own strength and capacity before the external support or intervention is withdrawn. Pulling the plug too early just leads to collapse. It requires patience and a focus on empowerment, not just perpetual support. Understanding this trap is a really key insight from the 1-Hour Guide by Anil Nathu material.
Okay, shifting the burden. 2 more traps left. Rule beating.
Ah, yes. The symptom here is when you see distorted, weird, unnatural behaviors emerging in a system, often in response to rules or regulations.
People following the letter of the law, but not the spirit.
Exactly. The cause is people or organizations taking evasive action to get around the intended purpose of a rule, while technically complying with its literal wording. This often happens when rules are poorly designed, overly rigid, complex, or out of sync with how the system actually works or wants to work.
Like the examples of weirdly shaped buildings squeezed onto lots to meet minimum zoning requirements, but clearly defeating the purpose of good urban planning.
Perfect example. Or companies finding loopholes to import restricted goods by slightly modifying the product description. Or performance metrics, leading people to game the system, focusing only on what's measured, even if it harms overall performance.
So how should we react to rule beating? Just clamp down harder.
The book suggests a more nuanced approach. See rule beating not just as defiance or cheating, but as valuable feedback. It's signaling that the rules aren't working properly, that there's a mismatch between the rule's intent and the system's dynamics.
Listen to the rule beating.
Yes, understand why it's happening. Then, instead of just adding more complex rules to plug the loophole, which often creates new opportunities for rule beating, try to revise the rules themselves to better align the system's natural self-organizing tendencies with the original purpose of the regulation. Make it easier or more natural to do the right thing.
Okay, rule beating as feedback. Finally, seeking the wrong goal.
This trap is arguably one of the most fundamental. The symptom is a system that works incredibly hard, efficiently, maybe even brilliantly. But it's achieving a result that, when you step back, isn't actually what anyone truly wanted or what's genuinely important for well-being.
Like being incredibly good at climbing a ladder that's leaning against the wrong wall.
Precisely. The cause is simply that the explicit or implicit goals of the system, or the indicators used to measure success and guide behavior, are defined inaccurately or incompletely. They don't reflect true purpose or welfare.
The classic example given is focusing obsessively on maximizing gross national product, GNP or GDP, as the primary goal for a nation.
Right. GNP measures economic activity, throughput, the flow of money. It's relatively easy to measure. But does it truly measure national well-being? Does it account for environmental degradation, inequality, depletion of natural resources, unpaid work, happiness, health?
Not really. You could cut down all your forests, sell the timber, boost GNP this year, but be much poorer in the long run.
Exactly. If quantity of throughput is your defined goal, quantity is what the system will optimize for, potentially at the expense of quality, sustainability, equity, or the health of the underlying capital stocks, natural, human, social.
So the way out is?
It's fundamental, and maybe the hardest. Step back and rigorously examine the goals. Are we measuring and striving for what truly matters? Or are we just pursuing what's easily measured, or what we've always pursued out of habit? It requires defining goals and indicators that genuinely reflect the desired state of the system in all its important dimensions, qualitative as well as quantitative.
Wow. Understanding these traps, policy resistance, tragedy of the commons, drift to low performance, escalation, success to the successful, shifting the burden, rule beating, seeking the wrong goal. It feels like having a diagnostic toolkit for dysfunctional systems.
It really is. Recognizing these patterns in the world around you or in your own organization or life is incredibly empowering. Because once you see the structure, you can start thinking about the leverage points.
Which brings us perfectly to Chapter 6, Leverage points places to intervene in a system. This is where the real potential for change lies, right? Finding those places where a small shift can cause a big change in the system's behavior.
Exactly. Donella Meadows offers a list of potential leverage points,
Mm.
ordered generally from lowest leverage to highest. But she cautions strongly that this isn't a rigid, foolproof recipe. The effectiveness of any leverage point is highly context dependent. It can be slippery, and intervening without understanding the system can still backfire.
Okay, caution noted. Let's start at the bottom. What has the least leverage, generally?
Parameters. These are the numbers, the constants, the coefficients in the system, things like tax rates, interest rates, minimum wage levels, pollution standards, birth rates.
We spend a lot of political energy arguing about these numbers.
We do. And they matter, but Meadows argues they usually offer low leverage for changing fundamental system behavior. Tweaking a tax rate slightly might change flows proportionally, but it rarely alters the underlying feedback structures or goals that drive the system,
Unless.
unless changing a parameter pushes the system across a critical threshold, causing a shift in loop dominance or triggering a nonlinear response. Sometimes a small change in a number can have big effects, but often it doesn't change the basic dynamics.
Okay, parameters are low leverage. What's next up the ladder?
The size of buffers. These are the stabilizing stocks relative to the flows in and out of them. Think of the amount of water in a large lake versus a small pond buffering against drought or flood, or the amount of money in your savings account buffering against income fluctuations, or the inventory in a store buffering against supply-demand mismatches, or the population size of an endangered species buffering against random events, or the amount of calcium stored in forest soils.
So bigger buffers generally mean more stability.
Yes, large buffers can significantly increase a system's resilience and stability by slowing things down and absorbing shocks. Making buffers bigger or smaller can be a leverage point, though often costly or slow.
Okay, buffers. Next.
Physical structure. This refers to the actual physical elements of the system and their tangible interconnections. The roads, the factories, the plumbing, the wiring, the landscape itself.
Can you change this easily?
Usually not. The leverage here is quite low after the structure is built. It's expensive and slow to rebuild cities or change transportation networks. The highest leverage related to physical structure is typically in the initial design phase. Understanding the system's limits, designing for resilience, avoiding putting strain on critical nodes, that's where the leverage is. Once it's built, you mostly have to live with it or make incremental changes.
Makes sense. Higher leverage than physical structure.
Delays. The length of time lags in the system, particularly in the feedback loops, relative to how fast the system is changing or needs to change.
We already saw how delays in balancing loops cause oscillations.
Exactly. Shortening or lengthening delays can be a significant leverage point, although often difficult to achieve. Systems become much harder to manage effectively when the inherent delays, like building times, information lags, response times, are very long compared to the rate at which interventions are needed. Think again about power plant construction responding to fluctuating demand or central planning. Managing delays or designing systems to function well despite delays has leverage.
Okay, delays. Now we start getting into the feedback loops themselves.
Yes. Next up is the strength or effectiveness of balancing feedback loops. Remember, these are the loops trying to correct deviations and keep a stock near a goal. The leverage point is in making them stronger or weaker relative to the destabilizing forces they are trying to counteract.
Like turning up the power on your thermostat if your house is really drafty.
Good analogy. Or, in economic systems, ensuring market prices reflect true costs, for example through carbon taxes or removing subsidies, strengthens the balancing feedback telling us to conserve resources. In political systems, ensuring free and accurate information flow strengthens the balancing feedback of public opinion on government actions.
So the power of the balancing loop needs to match the scale of the problem.
Precisely. A weak environmental agency, weak balancing loop, can't effectively regulate a massive, powerful industry, strong destabilizing force. A globalized economy likely needs globalized regulatory feedback to remain stable. Strengthening necessary balancing loops is a key leverage point.
Higher leverage still.
The gain around reinforcing feedback loops. These are the engines of growth or collapse the loops that drive exponential change. The leverage lies in adjusting how fast they amplify.
Like controlling birth rates or interest rates on investments or debt.
Exactly. Or intervening in those success to the successful loops to slow down the rate at which winners accumulate advantages. Because these loops compound, small changes in their gain or speed can have enormous effects over time, either fostering needed growth or preventing runaway spirals.
Okay, reinforcing loops. getting higher.
Information flows. The structure of who has access to what information, when they get it, and how accurate and relevant it is, this is a very high leverage point.
Why so high?
Because systems run on information. Missing, delayed, biased, or deliberately distorted information is a primary cause of system malfunction. Conversely, simply providing timely, accurate, relevant information to the right people at the right time is often one of the cheapest, easiest, and most effective ways to improve a system's behavior. It allows the system's own self-correcting mechanisms, like boundedly rational actors, to work better.
Like the toxic release inventory example again, just making pollution data public.
Perfect example. No new regulations were passed initially, just the release of information. But that information flow changed incentives, reputations, and awareness, leading many companies to significantly reduce their toxic emissions, often finding it was cost-effective to do so anyway. Fixing information flows is powerful.
Even higher leverage than information.
Rules. The incentives, punishments, constraints, and agreements that define the system's boundaries, possibilities, and limitations. Think constitutions, laws, regulations, property rights, contracts, unspoken social norms.
The rules of game.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Meadows argues that the power to change the rules is real power, changing who gets to vote, how markets are structured, what property rights exist, the criteria for success in an organization, like tenure rules or grading policies in a university. These interventions can fundamentally alter how the system operates and the outcomes it produces.
Like glasnost and perestroika changing the rules in the Soviet Union. Massive leverage.
Absolutely. Power over the rules is very high leverage.
What could possibly be higher leverage than changing the rules?
The power of self-organization. This is the system's inherent ability to add, change, or evolve its own structure, to learn, adapt, create novelty.
Like biological evolution.
That's the ultimate example. But also technological innovation, social revolutions, the ability of an ecosystem to adapt to changing conditions, or a company to reinvent its business model. This is the highest form of resilience, the ability not just to bounce back, but to change and become something new and better suited to the environment.
How do you influence self-organization?
Often by encouraging variability, experimentation, and diversity, and by setting enabling conditions or simple rules that allow constructive change to emerge, rather than trying to control everything rigidly. Fostering self-organization is higher leverage than just imposing rules from the top down.
Okay, self-organization. We're near the top now. What's next?
Goals. The overall purpose or function that the system is organized to achieve. This is ranked as higher leverage than even self-organization, because the goal determines the direction in which the system will self-organize. A system might be incredibly good at learning and adapting, but if its fundamental goal is flawed, like maximizing short-term profit at any cost, or winning a war regardless of human consequences, its self-organizing capabilities will be channeled towards achieving that potentially destructive goal.
So changing the goal redirects all that innovative energy.
Precisely. If you can change the system's overarching purpose, maybe through leadership, a shift in values, or collective decision, you can profoundly change its behavior, even if many of the lower-level rules and structures remain the same initially. Think of a company shifting its core goal from just shareholder value to stakeholder well-being, or a nation changing its definition of progress.
Okay, goals are hugely powerful. Only 2 left, second highest.
Paradigms. The shared mindset, the deep-seated beliefs, assumptions, and cultural understandings about the nature of reality that underlie everything else, the goals, the rules, the structures, the information flows. The paradigm is the source from which the system arises.
Like the fundamental worldview of a society or an organization.
Exactly. Changing the paradigm is the most society-altering kind of change. Think about the shift from believing the Earth was the center of the universe to understanding the solar system, Copernicus, or the shift from Newtonian physics to Einstein's relativity, or Adam Smith shifting economic thinking from mercantilism to free markets. These weren't just small tweaks. They fundamentally changed how people saw the world and organize their societies.
How do you change a paradigm? That sounds incredibly hard.
It is. Paradigms are deeply ingrained and often invisible to those who hold them. Meadows suggests that carefully building and testing models, making assumptions explicit, pointing out anomalies where the old paradigm fails, and consistently articulating and demonstrating a new, more effective paradigm are ways to start shifting them. But it's slow and difficult work.
And finally, the number 1 highest leverage point.
The power to transcend paradigms.
Transcend them. What does that mean?
It means realizing that no paradigm, no single worldview or mental model is the ultimate truth. It's the ability to remain unattached to any specific paradigm, To understand that all models are simplifications, limited perspectives on a reality that is always far richer and more complex than any description of it.
So it's about intellectual humility and flexibility.
Yes, and more. It's recognizing that even the idea of having paradigms is itself a paradigm. It's achieving a state of wisdom, perhaps what some traditions call enlightenment, where you are free from the constraints of fixed beliefs. You can choose to operate within one paradigm or another as needed without being bound by any of them. You embrace uncertainty and the state of not knowing.
That sounds profound and the highest leverage.
Because from that space of detachment and deep understanding, you can see the limitations of all systems and paradigms, and you can intervene, or choose not to intervene, with clarity, compassion, and effectiveness that isn't possible when you're trapped within a single worldview. It allows for the most fundamental and lasting kind of positive impact.
Wow, that's quite a journey up the leverage ladder. So, given all this complexity, the traps, the surprising behavior, the subtle leverage points, Chapter 7 offers advice on living in a world of systems. How do we navigate all this effectively in practice?
Right. It starts by acknowledging the reality. The world is complex, nonlinear, dynamic, and our understanding will always be incomplete. Pretending otherwise is foolish and dangerous. So the first piece of advice flows directly from that.
Which is,
Stay humble. Stay a learner. Always. Approach interventions and decisions with humility. Learn by doing, by experimenting cautiously. Think small steps, pilot projects. Monitor the results constantly and closely. Be genuinely willing to admit errors and change course when the system tells you you're wrong.
error embracing, the book calls it.
Yes. See, mistakes not as failures, but as opportunities to learn more about how the system actually works. And share that information openly. Living with uncertainty and being transparent about it actually builds trust and credibility far more than pretending to have all the answers.
Okay, humility and learning. What else?
Celebrate complexity. Instead of always trying to control, simplify, homogenize, and impose rigid order, learn to appreciate and even celebrate the messy, creative, self-organizing aspects of systems. Value diversity, variety, redundancy, and even a degree of healthy disorder. These are often sources of resilience and innovation.
Like Aldo Leopold's land ethic that the book quotes.
Exactly. And action is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. That respects the complex wholeness of the system.
Expand time horizons. This came up earlier, too.
It's crucial. We need to constantly fight the pervasive pressure for short-term results driven by election cycles, quarterly reports, quick payback periods, high discount rates that make the future seem worthless. Contrast that with thinking about consequences over generations, like the seventh generation perspective attributed to some Native American cultures.
Does that mean ignoring the short term?
No, not at all. You have to manage both. Watch the short-term dynamics, but always keep the long-term trends and viability in view. See the whole system unfolding across time. Longer time horizons dramatically improve the chances of sustainable, healthy outcomes.
Defy the disciplines.
Yes. Don't let artificial academic or professional boundaries limit your thinking. Follow the system wherever it leads you. If you're studying an economic problem that clearly involves psychology, ecology, and politics, then learn something about psychology, ecology, and politics.
Integrate knowledge.
Exactly. Learn from people in different fields. Recognize the blind spots and distortions that come from any single narrow perspective. Systems thinking demands boundary crossing.
Increase information flow. This was a high leverage point, too.
It bears repeating. Distorting, delaying, hiding, or ignoring vital information is one of the most common ways systems are driven crazy. Conversely, improving the quality, timeliness, accuracy, and distribution of information is often a powerful and relatively easy way to improve system function. Let the system see itself better.
The toxic release inventory, again, showing the power of transparency.
A prime example of how information itself can drive positive change.
Pay attention to what is important, not just what is measurable. This links back to the seeking the wrong goal trap.
It does. Be constantly vigilant against the tendency to define success only by what's easy to quantify, especially if those metrics don't capture what truly matters for the system's health and purpose. Remember the GMP example. If quantity is your goal, quantity is what you'll get, potentially sacrificing quality, equity, or sustainability.
So we need to value qualitative assessment, too.
Absolutely. Find ways to bring the qualitative, the hard-to-measure, but critically important aspects of the system into the decision-making process. Don't let the easily measurable drive out the truly important.
Seek the good of the whole.
This is about countering that sub-optimization trap. where individual parts or subsystems pursue their own goals brilliantly but end up harming the larger system they belong to. Systems thinking constantly encourages you to step back, see the bigger picture, understand the interdependencies, and act in ways that support the health and viability of the whole system, not just your own little piece of it.
Expose your mental models to the light of day.
Make your own assumptions about how the system works explicit. Draw the diagrams, write down the theories, share them with others. Be open to having your models questioned, critiqued, and improved. Recognize that all models are simplifications, flawed approximations of reality. The goal isn't to have a perfect model, but to have models that are useful and constantly improving.
Honor, respect, and listen to the information in the system.
Treat the feedback the system provides, whether through numbers, stories, or direct observation, with care and respect. Avoid language pollution, using meaningless jargon, euphemisms, or overly technical language that obscures reality rather than clarifies it. Strive to enlarge your language to better discuss complexity and nuance. Be a quality detector, trying to sense the true state and health of the system beneath the surface noise.
And the last guideline, locate responsibility within the system.
This is about system design. Strive to design systems where decision-makers directly and quickly experience the consequences of their own decisions. Create tight, rapid feedback loops between action and result for those in charge.
Intrinsic responsibility, the book calls it.
Yes. Think about an airline pilot. They get immediate feedback if they make a mistake. Contrast that with a CEO whose decisions might not impact the bottom line for years, or a politician voting on regulations whose effects they never personally experience.
Or the examples of individual thermostats giving cost feedback versus a central one, or wastewater pipes being downstream of water intakes.
Right. Or charging people directly for the costs of unhealthy behaviors versus spreading the costs through insurance. The book points out, critically, that many systems are poorly designed for this. Decision-makers are often insulated from the consequences of their choices, especially negative consequences that affect others or the future. Designing for intrinsic responsibility is a powerful way to encourage wiser decisions.
And just looping back one last time, understanding those system traps we talked about, like policy resistance, or especially that shifting the burden dynamic highlighted by the 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu material, and knowing those leverage points, that gives you practical tools for applying these principles, right?
Absolutely. Recognizing a recurring trap like shifting the burden immediately tells you where not to intervene, just relieving symptoms, and where the real leverage lies, strengthening the system's own capacity. Seeing the leverage points helps you focus your energy where it's likely to have the most impact.
So wrapping up, the immense value of digging into thinking in systems, even just through these excerpts, really lies in getting this deeper understanding. Understanding how systems work, their basic building blocks, recognizing those common patterns, both the traps and the opportunities they represent, and gaining crucial insights into where we might best intervene to foster positive, lasting change.
And maybe to leave you, the listener, with one final thought to chew on, drawn from that highest leverage point. What if you tried, just for a day, to hold your own strongest beliefs and assumptions about how the world works a little more lightly? To acknowledge that your paradigm, your worldview, is just one possible lens on an infinitely complex reality. What possibilities might open up if you could truly embrace that openness of not knowing? There's immense power, the book suggests, in transcending paradigms.
That's definitely something to think about, a fantastic exploration.
Thank you for joining us today. Buy the book at the 1-Hour Guide website for more business insights.